That's Israel striking Hezbollah targets across the border in Lebanon. This is Benjamin Netanyahu says the IDF now is winding down the current phase of its operations inside Gaza. Meanwhile, tens of thousands of Israelis are calling for an end to the fighting and the return of all hostages still held by Hamas. Netanyahu says he is not ready to completely pull his forces just yet. Listen.
I'm not prepared to end the war and leave Hamas in place. I'm prepared to do a partial deal. That's no secret. That would return some of the people to us.
Right, so he's not going to pack up wholesale IDF operations and withdraw from Gaza. General Keane, if you were advising the Israeli prime minister right now, what would you tell him his next best move, next immediate step is?
Well, he has to continue to clear operations in Rafah. He's rendered 2 of the 4 battalions there ineffective. He's got a couple more that he's trying to degrade. Some of the forces in Rafah, like in other parts of Gaza, they have moved out of the way of the Israelis because they want to preserve a certain element of the force. So I think he's got to complete those clearing operations. Then he knows full well that there are other organizations in Han Yunis to the north of Rafah and further north of that in Gaza City that over a period of weeks he'll have to continue to conduct not major clearing operations but more targeted raids to deal with the remnants of Hamas. He doesn't want to leave a force in place that can regroup, reorganize, and at some point reattack. But meanwhile, as mentioned in the introduction, he knows full well that he's got a major problem with Hezbollah in Lebanon because there are 80,000 people who have evacuated from the northern Israel homes that they've lived in. And I think you have a map we can show the audience what's going on here. And what he's facing is the reality that he needs to return those 80,000 people to their homes. And to do that, he has to move the forces that are moved into southern Lebanon. Those are military-like forces. They have close to 100,000 troops in the Hezbollah military. That's not the right map for some reason. But anyway, let me just talk through it.
Yep. There's
a river that's north of the northern Israeli border, and it's called the Litani River. And below that river is where most of the military forces are, and he has an operation to conduct there. That is what he's going to focus on next. He wants Hezbollah to withdraw those forces diplomatically, and the Biden administration has been trying to work something like that for the last 2 weeks. It has not materialized. If that doesn't happen, I don't believe Prime Minister Netanyahu has much choice. He cannot let Hezbollah redefine the Israeli border. And that's just the facts of it. And that's what they've done right now with 80,000 having moved away from it. He wants those people to be able to return and return sovereignty to his border. So his choices are conduct an air campaign very comprehensively to push Hezbollah back across the Litani River, or do an air and ground campaign to accomplish much of the same. This is very challenging. These forces are much more formidable than Hamas. They got tens of thousands of rockets and missiles. They will attempt to overwhelm the air defense system of Israel if this comprehensive attack takes place. It will be a significant escalation in military activities if the Israelis have to push the Hezbollah military away from the border.
General Keane, very insightful analysis from you as always. Thank you for taking time with us this morning. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm Steve Doocy.
I'm Brian Kilmeade.
And I'm Ainsley Earhart. And click here to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page to catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis.